The history of the welfare system began gradually, but still many people were missing out on social aid as stringent rules were still in place that only catered for the few that had paid into the system. This episode shows how little was available in the early 20th century, but it's improving, and let's see how. In the year of 1911, the National Insurance Act was passed, which entitled a person who came out of work to claim, but it was not that easy to receive help. Firstly, it only applied to the wage earners and not their families, and they would be paid up to 15 weeks of unemployment at a rate of 7 shillings per week in 1912. That's around £36.34, regardless of the size of the family. Moreover, not all industries were covered due to what they call actuaries. This is a mathematical calculation of which industries were more volatile. Only the more insecure industries could participate, such as seasonal work or manual work. Again, a contribution from the worker and the government was required in order to claim these benefits. So, for example, if you were in a well-paid job such as an office clerk or in a bank, you wouldn't be entitled to claim or to pay into the contribution system. The introduction of the Employment Insurance Act of 1920 saw an expansion of both eligible persons and the amount of time this benefit could be claimed. It was called the Dole system, which entitled an unemployed person to claim for up to 39 weeks provided they had paid in. The word dole in Middle English means allotted portion. However, certain job descriptions were still not entitled, thus did not pay or receive from the scheme. This would include domestic workers such as maids and servants, civil servants, farmers and firefighters. The Old Age Pensions Act was passed in 1908, which was paid by general taxation. The age of the beneficiaries had to be 70 years old, and they were paid at a rate of 5 shillings per person per week, which is around £23 today, as of 2025. A married couple would receive 7 shillings and sixpence, around £37, which by today's standards is extremely low. This was deliberate, in order to encourage people to pay into private pensions or save for their own retirements as not to rely on the state. Applicants had to meet a criteria of not having any private means of over £31 a year, and they would have to have lived in the UK for 20 years or more. It was not automatic, however, as a person had to be in good character and had not been in prison for less than 10 years before applying. Also, a conviction for drunkenness could also deprive a person from receiving a state pension. Surprisingly, those who what they called in those days that were in lunatic asylums, known today as psychiatric hospitals, would not get awarded. People applied in 1908 in time for the first pension payout in 1909. It was approved by the Board of Pensions that people would collect from a post office as opposed to handouts given from them by the social welfare offices in order to save embarrassment, as some elderly people thought they were taking money for nothing or receiving a charitable gift. Some recipients gave fruit to the tellers handing out the money at the post offices, and other gifts of gratitude. Winston Churchill was quoted to say, "It may be little unless you haven't got it." Led by David Lloyd George, the People's Budget was set to pay for all these new reforms. This meant higher taxes for the rich. More money was raised by taxation on products such as tobacco, alcohol and land. The idea was very well received by the majority. The minimum wage is not as recent as one would think, as we remember Tony Blair, the New Labour Prime Minister in the 1990s, boasting about it as a great reform. Minimum salary awards started in 1909, but they were phased out with the introduction of the family allowance in 1945 and were simply just forgotten about. The first job centres were advocated by William Beveridge in 1908, then called labour exchanges. They started to appear in the UK from 1908, to which by 1910 there were 62 offices opened. This was a governmental run scheme. It was a central place for advertising employment and where people would collect their benefits on a weekly basis. After 4 years, the amount of these labour exchanges rose to 169 countrywide. Clients, as they were then called, would have an unemployment record book where they would have national insurance payments proved by applying stamps onto the card placed in these books during the time they were in work. They would have to buy a weekly national insurance stamp from the post office, which the employer held. So the employer would hold their cards and the Works Accounts Department would stick on the stamps. When a person became unemployed, the workplace would give them their cards, which they would take to the labour exchange to prove that their national insurance was paid up. The phrase "getting your cards" when leaving a service or getting the sack is still used today, although the system was phased out many years ago. The amount of stamps on this card would determine how long you would get your benefits. Visits to the labour exchange would combine with looking at advertised jobs and signing to receive their dole money, which was payable up to 12 months. After that, they got nothing. Non-contributory benefits did not exist. However, war soldiers could claim without stamps, and they could claim for their families. Prime Minister David Lloyd George changed the name of the centres to employment exchanges to reflect that they were a central plexus for finding work, as well as claiming unemployment cash. This was in 1917 and now being run by the new Minister of Labour. The Beveridge Report. William Beveridge, a social expert, had identified in his report that combating the 5 evil giants would lead to economic recovery in 1942. This was during the Second World War, where Labour and the Conservatives had formed a coalition government. Highlighting that there were times were exceptionally difficult, something had to be done to change the attitude of the people. He discovered that want, disease, squalor, ignorance and idleness were the 5 evil giants that needed to be addressed in order to get on the road to reconstruction. This was taken seriously by the government and praised by many, and went towards making reforms that could lead to the totally governmental run welfare state and national insurance health service in years to come. Mr. Beveridge in his report proposed there should not be just sectional interests but revolutionary changes and not just patching up. Beveridge was opposed to means-tested benefits. He saw that contributions should be evened out and paid in the same equal manner. Means-tested benefits he saw was a lead to the poverty trap. Those who had not worked or paid contributions would perhaps have no incentive to look for employment. He pointed out that benefits should be held at a subsistence level as not to encourage people making a life of being on the dole. That whilst out of work training should be encouraged and education also, to the threat of employment benefits being withdrawn for non-compliance. Although some of his ideas were carried out, many of them were watered down or withdrawn. The Second World War led to a more government intervention in the welfare of the British people. Rationing was introduced in order to let the entire country not run out of food and starve. The idea was to make sure no matter how rich a person was, that they would not have the chance to buy up all the less available items, leaving nothing for the less fortunate. Ration books saw to this fairness, but allowances were low and still the items needed to be paid for. However, free milk was made available to expectant mothers and young children. Family allowance was being developed during this time, and it was on the cards for the near future and would come into fruition in 1945. Interestingly, bread was the last item to be rationed and was done so after the war had ended. Rationing itself ceased in 1954, 9 years after the end of the Second World War. The introduction of the National Injuries Act, paid by the means of national insurance contributions, was the first benefit that involved all workers from all sectors and was introduced in 1946 under the Labour government led by Clement Attlee. This meant that anyone injured in the workplace was entitled to claim a benefit during the time they could not work. It provided an injury benefit or even a disability benefit for those permanently injured and a death benefit for fatalities in the workplace, which would be paid out to the beneficiaries, in most cases the spouse. This had to be proved by means of attending a tribunal, which the claimant was having to prove their case without any legal backup. These cases were hard to prove, but one could appeal a decision.